On September 14, 1942, the operational situation on Guadalcanal remained unstable and unresolved. More than a month after the initial U.S. landings, control of the island was still contested, and neither side possessed the logistical or numerical strength to secure a decisive advantage. The airfield at Lunga Point, renamed Henderson Field by American forces, functioned as the central strategic asset in the campaign. Its continued operation allowed U.S. aircraft to contest Japanese naval movement through the surrounding waters, but it also made the perimeter around the field a constant target for ground infiltration, artillery fire, and air attack. By mid-September, the U.S. 1st Marine Division was holding a thin defensive line around Henderson Field, relying on limited artillery, inconsistent air cover, and fragile supply lines that stretched back to the New Hebrides. Communication between forward positions, command posts, and supporting units depended almost entirely on field radios. Telephone wire was frequently cut by shellfire or jungle movement. Visual signaling was ineffective in dense terrain. Runners were slow and exposed. Radio traffic, despite its vulnerabilities, remained the only reliable method for maintaining situational awareness across the perimeter. Within this system, radio operators were not combat decision-makers, but they were critical nodes. Their role was procedural: receive, encode, transmit, repeat. The work was technical, repetitive, and tightly governed by signal protocols. Every transmission risked interception. Japanese forces operating in the area possessed capable direction-finding equipment, and both sides were aware that prolonged radio use could reveal positions to enemy artillery or night infiltration teams. One such operator was Corporal James A. Hargreaves, assigned to a signal detachment supporting a Marine infantry battalion positioned along the southern edge of the Lunga perimeter. Hargreaves had arrived on Guadalcanal in August as part of a replacement draft and had been in continuous operations for nearly 4 weeks. His primary responsibility was operating a portable SCR-300 radio set, a battery-powered FM transceiver that allowed direct communication between battalion headquarters and forward companies. The SCR-300 was relatively advanced for its time, but it had limitations. Its effective range in jungle conditions was unpredictable. The batteries drained quickly in humid heat. The set required frequent antenna adjustment to maintain signal clarity. More importantly, it emitted a signal strong enough to be detected by enemy direction-finding units, particularly when transmissions exceeded standard length. Hargreaves worked in short shifts, usually stationed just behind a rifle platoon command post. His routine involved logging incoming messages, confirming coordinates, and relaying orders from battalion headquarters. Most transmissions were brief: requests for resupply, position confirmations, or casualty reports. The system functioned only as long as discipline was maintained. Operators were trained to keep transmissions concise and avoid unnecessary repetition. By September, that discipline was under strain. Japanese forces had increased nighttime probing attacks along the southern and western perimeter. These were not large assaults but small unit infiltrations designed to locate weak points and gather intelligence. U.S. patrols reported hearing movement in the jungle after dark, often without visual contact. Occasional mortar fire suggested enemy artillery units were adjusting their range based on observed activity. On several nights, positions that had transmitted extended radio messages were subjected to indirect fire within hours. While not conclusive, the pattern was noted by signal officers. The battalion's communications log showed a correlation between longer transmissions and subsequent shelling in at least 3 separate incidents. Despite this, operational demands continued to increase radio traffic. Units were stretched thin, supply levels were inconsistent, and coordination between artillery, infantry, and air support required constant updates. Commanders requested more frequent position reports. Forward observers transmitted corrections for fire missions. Medical teams called for evacuation instructions. The radio network remained active well beyond recommended limits. Hargreaves, like most operators in the sector, was aware of the risk. He had received briefings on enemy interception capabilities and had been instructed to terminate transmissions if unusual interference or signal echo was detected. In practice, however, the pressure to maintain contact often outweighed theoretical concerns about interception. On the evening of September 14th, weather conditions further complicated communications. A steady tropical rain reduced visibility and dampened sound, while humidity interfered with signal strength. Several units reported difficulty maintaining contact with battalion headquarters. Hargreaves spent much of the early evening repeating position confirmations and attempting to relay supply requests that failed to transmit cleanly. At approximately 21:40 hours, a forward platoon requested updated artillery coverage coordinates after detecting possible enemy movement near a river crossing. The message required multiple clarifications, and the transmission extended well beyond standard protocol. Hargreaves noted unusual static and intermittent signal distortion but continued transmitting after receiving confirmation from headquarters to repeat the coordinates. Less than an hour later, mortar rounds impacted approximately 300 meters south of his position. The shells did not cause casualties but landed close enough to indicate ranging fire. The platoon command post relocated slightly deeper into cover, and Hargreaves adjusted his antenna to maintain contact. By midnight, radio traffic had increased again. Several companies reported scattered movement in the jungle, though no direct engagements occurred. Battalion headquarters requested updated status reports from all forward units. Hargreaves transmitted 3 separate position confirmations within a 40-minute period. Shortly after 1:15 hours, Japanese artillery fired again, this time closer and more accurate. One round struck near a supply dump, destroying several crates of ammunition and medical supplies. A second round landed near a communication trench used by another signal team. The pattern suggested targeted fire rather than random bombardment. The battalion signal officer, monitoring transmissions from a rear command post, issued a general advisory to reduce radio use unless operationally necessary. The message emphasized brevity and instructed operators to delay non-essential reports until daylight. Hargreaves received the advisory and acknowledged it. However, within minutes, another request arrived from headquarters for confirmation of the southern sector's defensive alignment. The request required a detailed response, including unit positions and available ammunition levels. This created a procedural conflict. Standard signal doctrine prioritized command requests over field discretion. At the same time, recent events suggested that extended transmissions were attracting enemy fire. The advisory from the signal officer did not carry the same authority as a direct order from headquarters. Hargreaves prepared to transmit the requested information. He adjusted the radio's tuning dial, confirmed battery output, and initiated the call sign. As the signal cleared, he hesitated. The previous transmissions had been followed by shelling. The interference patterns suggested active enemy monitoring. The current request would require several minutes of continuous transmission. The platoon command post remained in a vulnerable position. The surrounding jungle offered concealment but limited protection against indirect fire. Ammunition supplies were already low. Medical evacuation routes were poorly marked and difficult to navigate at night. Hargreaves had no authority to refuse transmission, but he did have limited discretion over timing. Signal manuals permitted operators to delay messages briefly if interference was detected or if security conditions were unfavorable. The definition of unfavorable was left deliberately vague. He initiated the transmission, delivered the initial call sign and acknowledgement, then paused. The radio remained active, but he did not continue with the full report. Instead, he monitored the signal band for additional interference and waited for further instruction from either headquarters or the signal officer. No immediate response came. The channel remained clear but unstable. Static increased, and faint overlapping signals suggested other transmissions in the area. After approximately 30 seconds, Hargreaves terminated the transmission entirely and logged it as incomplete. He did not inform headquarters of the delay. He simply recorded the attempt and maintained radio silence. The decision was minor in practical terms. It did not alter any immediate orders or reposition units. No one at headquarters noticed the missing report. Yet within the context of the night's events, it represented a deviation from established procedure. For the remainder of the night, Hargreaves limited transmissions to emergency traffic only. No further artillery fire impacted his immediate sector. Other areas of the perimeter, however, continued to receive sporadic shelling. By dawn, battalion headquarters issued a formal directive to reduce all radio traffic during nighttime hours and rely more heavily on scheduled reporting windows. The directive cited increased evidence of enemy signal monitoring and recommended greater discretion in transmission length and frequency. Hargreaves's incomplete transmission was never formally reviewed. It remained a single line in a communication log, indistinguishable from dozens of other minor disruptions recorded during the campaign. At the time, it was not considered significant. It was simply a pause in routine procedure, prompted by operational conditions rather than command instruction. The operational problem, balancing communication needs against signal security, remained unresolved. Radio traffic continued to expose unit positions, while commanders depended on constant updates to manage a fragile defensive perimeter. The system functioned, but only imperfectly, and under conditions that made small procedural decisions increasingly consequential. By the end of September, Guadalcanal had become not only a physical battlefield but a communications environment in which information itself carried risk. Signal operators, trained to maintain connectivity at all costs, were now operating within a system where every transmission potentially revealed more than it conveyed. Hargreaves returned to regular duty the following morning, continuing to transmit position reports, supply requests, and fire coordination messages as required. The pause from the previous night was not mentioned again. No formal record explained why the transmission had been terminated. It remained a moment of individual discretion within a system built on standardized procedure. At the time, it appeared inconsequential. On September 15, 1942, the operational environment around Henderson Field continued to deteriorate. Overnight artillery fire had disrupted supply movement along several interior paths, and multiple forward units reported difficulty maintaining contact with battalion headquarters. The previous day's advisory to limit radio traffic had reduced transmission volume slightly, but it did not eliminate the underlying dependency on wireless communication. The structural problem remained unchanged. The defensive perimeter was too wide, the terrain too dense, and the supporting infrastructure too fragile for any system other than radio to function consistently. Wire communications failed regularly due to shelling, flooding, or simple physical degradation. Visual signaling was impractical beyond short distances. Runners required hours to move between positions and were frequently delayed or lost. Commanders continued to rely on radio as their primary operational instrument, even as evidence mounted that the enemy was actively exploiting it. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had deployed mobile signal interception teams equipped with direction-finding receivers capable of triangulating FM transmissions. These teams operated independently from frontline assault units, often positioning themselves in elevated jungle terrain to monitor American signal traffic. Their objective was not to decode messages, most were encrypted or compressed, but to identify transmission sources and relay approximate coordinates to artillery or mortar units. U.S. intelligence was aware of this capability in general terms, but precise data on Japanese interception efficiency was limited. Most assessments were based on post-action reports and pattern analysis rather than direct observation. As a result, signal doctrine emphasized discipline and brevity without offering concrete operational alternatives. Within the southern sector, several units experienced repeated shelling shortly after extended radio transmissions. The pattern was consistent but not universal. Some transmissions were followed by nothing. Others were followed by indirect fire within minutes. The inconsistency made it difficult for commanders to determine whether the correlation was causal or coincidental. For signal operators like Hargreaves, this ambiguity created a practical dilemma. Their training emphasized procedural compliance: transmit when ordered, repeat if necessary, maintain connectivity at all times. At the same time, the operational environment increasingly suggested that compliance itself was generating tactical vulnerability. Hargreaves resumed normal operations on the morning of the 15th. His position had shifted slightly overnight, relocating approximately 80 meters east into denser vegetation. The new location offered better overhead concealment but reduced line-of-sight access to adjacent units. Signal strength fluctuated throughout the day, requiring frequent antenna adjustment. Radio traffic intensified during the afternoon. Japanese aircraft conducted intermittent reconnaissance flights over the perimeter, prompting multiple air defense alerts. Ground units requested updated anti-aircraft coordination, ammunition inventories, and casualty estimates. Battalion headquarters issued overlapping directives, some of which required confirmation from multiple forward positions. The volume of transmissions exceeded standard operating limits. Operators worked extended shifts, often without full battery replacement or equipment maintenance. Humidity degraded component performance, and several SCR 300 units experienced intermittent power loss. For Hargreaves, the repeated choice to delay or abbreviate transmissions became routine. What had initially felt like an exception now became part of his standard operating behavior. The pause he had initiated on September 14th was no longer isolated. It was one instance within a growing pattern of informal discretion exercised by operators across the perimeter. The system continued to function, but increasingly through unspoken modifications made at the lowest operational level. By the third week of September 1942, the operational environment around Henderson Field had entered a period of relative tactical stability. Major Japanese ground assaults had decreased in frequency, replaced by intermittent artillery fire, small-scale patrol activity, and sustained aerial harassment. The defensive perimeter remained under pressure, but the tempo had shifted from immediate crisis to prolonged attrition. For the Marine units holding the southern and eastern sectors, this change did not reduce operational strain. It altered its character. Instead of responding to large, coordinated attacks, commanders were now required to interpret fragmented signals, scattered enemy movement, ambiguous reconnaissance reports, and irregular shelling patterns. Communication became more central rather than less. Radio traffic increased again. The reduction in direct assault did not lead to a reduction in coordination requirements. On the contrary, the dispersed nature of Japanese activity required more frequent situational updates. Units requested clarification on patrol routes, artillery coverage, resupply priorities, and medical evacuation readiness. Each request generated additional transmissions across already congested channels. Signal operators remained embedded within this system, executing procedures that had not materially changed since early September. Official guidance still emphasized transmission discipline and encryption, but did not address signal origin exposure. The field advisories issued earlier remained informal and unenforced. Hargreaves continued operating from his forward relay position. The terrain around his post had become increasingly degraded. Heavy rainfall turned footpaths into shallow trenches. Equipment was coated in mud and organic debris. Antenna lines required constant repositioning as foliage collapsed or was cut back for visibility. The SCR-300 radio set he operated had begun to show signs of sustained wear. Battery performance declined, requiring more frequent replacements. Internal components were affected by moisture, producing occasional distortion and signal drift. These technical limitations further complicated operational decisions about transmission timing and duration. Despite these challenges, radio traffic intensified. On September 21st, regimental headquarters initiated a series of coordinated reconnaissance sweeps across the southern sector. Each sweep required synchronization between infantry patrols, artillery observers, and supply units. The plan relied heavily on real-time communication to adjust movement patterns and respond to enemy contact. Hargreaves received multiple transmission requests during the afternoon and evening. Some required immediate relay. Others were status confirmations or logistical updates. The channel remained crowded, with overlapping signals and frequent static interference. During one transmission window, Hargreaves detected a persistent secondary signal operating on a nearby frequency band. The signal was not strong enough to interfere directly, but it remained constant throughout multiple transmission cycles. Its presence suggested active monitoring rather than incidental noise. He noted the frequency and duration in his log. Similar entries appeared in signal logs from other operators in the same sector. The pattern was no longer sporadic. It was consistent. That night, Japanese artillery resumed limited shelling across several forward positions. The impacts were dispersed but targeted. In 3 separate cases, shells landed within close proximity to command posts that had recently transmitted detailed movement reports. No direct correlation could be formally established. However, the pattern was sufficient to generate renewed concern among frontline signal teams. The battalion signal officer convened a small, informal meeting with several operators, including Hargreaves. The discussion was procedural rather than doctrinal. There were no formal orders issued. Instead, the officer acknowledged the recurring reports and suggested that operators continue exercising discretion where technically justified. The language was cautious. He emphasized that maintaining communication remained the primary mission. At the same time, he conceded that excessive transmission duration appeared to increase exposure risk. There was no official guidance on how to resolve the contradiction. For Hargreaves, the problem had shifted from situational to structural. His earlier hesitation to transmit had been reactive. He had delayed messages in response to immediate risk. Now, he faced a more sustained decision: whether to continue following doctrine strictly or to adjust his behavior proactively based on accumulated field experience. On September 23, a routine operational test provided the first clear personal turning point. At approximately 1810 hours, Headquarters requested a full perimeter status report from all forward relay stations. The report required precise grid coordinates, personnel strength estimates, ammunition levels, and patrol readiness data. The transmission window allocated to Hargreaves was 6 minutes. At the time of the request, atmospheric conditions were unfavorable. Static interference was moderate, and signal overlap indicated multiple active transmissions across adjacent sectors. In addition, Hargreaves detected the same persistent secondary signal that had appeared earlier in the week. Under standard procedure, the report should have been transmitted immediately. Instead, Hargreaves delayed. He acknowledged receipt of the request but cited temporary interference. He then waited nearly 20 minutes before initiating transmission. During that time, he monitored the frequency band and noted continued signal activity consistent with external monitoring. When he finally transmitted, he altered the structure of the report. He provided general status summaries rather than specific grid coordinates. He compressed ammunition estimates into broad categories and omitted detailed patrol schedules. The transmission lasted less than half the allocated time. This deviation exceeded discretionary technical adjustment. It constituted an operational choice. The report was received without immediate objection. Headquarters did not request clarification or missing data. Other sectors transmitted similar abbreviated reports, suggesting that multiple operators were independently modifying procedures. Approximately 30 minutes later, Japanese artillery targeted a position approximately 1 kilometer north of Hargreaves's relay point. The shells were accurate and concentrated, causing casualties among a command element that had transmitted a full report earlier in the cycle. Hargreaves's immediate area remained untouched. This outcome did not establish causality. The artillery targeting could have been based on independent reconnaissance. However, the timing reinforced existing perceptions among signal operators. In his log, Hargreaves noted the correlation without drawing conclusions. The entry was factual: transmission time, signal conditions, subsequent shelling in adjacent sector. This pattern repeated over the following days. On September 25, Hargreaves withheld a scheduled patrol coordination update until after midnight, transmitting only partial data. No shelling occurred in his sector that night, while 2 other positions experienced indirect fire following extended transmissions. On September 27, he terminated a transmission early after detecting signal overlap. Another relay station that completed its full transmission was shelled within 15 minutes. These observations were not formally reported. They remained in personal logs and informal discussions among operators. There was no mechanism for aggregating or validating such field-level behavioral changes. At the same time, pressure from headquarters increased. Operational planning required accurate, timely data. Commanders expressed frustration with incomplete reports and delayed updates. Several after-action reviews noted inconsistencies in signal traffic, including missing grid references and irregular reporting intervals. The contradictions became explicit. Frontline operators were modifying procedures to reduce perceived risk, while command structures required greater information density to manage dispersed operations. Hargreaves was summoned to a routine equipment inspection conducted by the battalion signal officer. The inspection focused on technical performance rather than operational behavior. His radio set passed functional assessment, though component wear was noted. During the inspection, the officer asked generally about interference patterns. Hargreaves reported persistent secondary signals and frequent overlap. He did not explicitly state that he was withholding information. He framed his adjustments as technical necessity rather than operational judgment. The officer acknowledged the interference but reiterated the importance of maintaining communication flow. No disciplinary action was taken. No formal instruction was issued. The system remained unresolved. By the end of September, Hargreaves had established a consistent personal procedure. He monitored signal conditions continuously. He delayed non-essential transmissions during periods of high interference. He compressed message content whenever possible. He avoided transmitting precise coordinates unless explicitly ordered under urgent conditions. These decisions were not recorded as deviations. They were embedded within routine technical language, interference, static, signal congestion. In practice, however, Hargreaves had altered the functional role of the radio operator. He was no longer acting solely as a transmission conduit. He was filtering operational information based on his assessment of tactical risk. This role was not part of his training. It was not part of signal doctrine. It emerged from sustained exposure to operational consequences. The risk had become personal. Each transmission now carried a dual implication. It fulfilled a command requirement, but it also potentially exposed nearby personnel to enemy targeting. Hargreaves was no longer responding to isolated incidents. He was making repeated, deliberate decisions about what information to transmit, when to transmit it, and what to omit. These decisions were invisible to most of the command structure. They did not appear in operational reports. They were not discussed in formal channels. They existed only at the level of individual judgment, embedded within a system that offered no explicit framework for balancing communication and concealment. By early October, similar behavior patterns were evident across multiple signal units. Operators were compressing reports, delaying transmissions, and relying on prearranged codes beyond doctrinal limits. These changes were not coordinated. They emerged organically. The communication system was still functioning, but it was no longer operating according to formal design. It had become a hybrid structure shaped by frontline adaptation rather than institutional planning. Hargreaves remained in position, continuing his routine duties. His official role had not changed. His practical behavior had. The pause he had initiated earlier in September had evolved into a sustained operational practice. By early October 1942, the cumulative effects of informal adaptation within the signal network had become visible at the operational level. Reports arriving at regimental headquarters showed increasing variation in format, detail, and timing. Some units transmitted full status updates as before. Others submitted compressed summaries. Several forward positions began reporting only when directly prompted. The differences were not random. They reflected individual judgments made by operators embedded in different tactical conditions. However, from the perspective of command, the result was uneven situational awareness. Operational planning increasingly relied on partial data. Regimental staff officers noted discrepancies between expected and actual ammunition levels, patrol readiness, and unit positioning. In several cases, supply convoys arrived at locations that no longer matched transmitted coordinates. Artillery support was delayed because fire direction centers lacked precise forward observer data. Medical evacuation requests were sometimes received with insufficient location detail, requiring additional clarification transmissions. These problems were documented in internal memoranda. The language remained technical: communication inefficiency, reporting inconsistency, coordination delay. No formal reference was made to enemy signal interception. At the same time, Japanese artillery activity continued to show patterns consistent with radio-based targeting. Shelling remained concentrated near known command posts and relay stations, particularly following extended transmission windows. While not every transmission was followed by fire, the correlation persisted often enough to reinforce frontline perceptions. The contradiction between command requirements and operational risk reached a point where it could no longer remain implicit. On October 6, regimental headquarters issued a formal directive addressing signal discipline. The directive emphasized the necessity of standardized reporting formats, complete data transmission, and adherence to scheduled communication windows. It referenced recent coordination failures and cited the need for improved command efficiency. The directive did not mention interception or direction finding. For signal operators, the directive created a direct conflict. It required behaviors that frontline experience suggested were unsafe. It formalized expectations that many operators had already begun to deviate from informally. Hargreaves received the directive through normal channels. The instruction required him to resume full reporting, including precise grid references and detailed unit status, during all scheduled transmission periods. The directive included no guidance on managing interference or signal monitoring beyond standard technical procedures. That night, Hargreaves faced a renewed operational dilemma. At approximately 21:40 hours, he received a request from headquarters for an updated defensive alignment report. The report required full positional data for 3 forward platoons and ammunition estimates for heavy weapons. Signal conditions were unfavorable. Interference was high, and the persistent secondary signal was present again. The pattern matched previous nights that had preceded shelling incidents. Under the new directive, he was required to transmit the full report without delay. Hargreaves acknowledged the request and began preparing the message. He assembled the data from unit logs and prepared to transmit according to standardized format. Before initiating transmission, he monitored the frequency band for several minutes. Signal overlap was continuous. The secondary signal remained stable. He delayed again. This delay was no longer justified by technical necessity alone. It was a direct violation of a formal directive. After approximately 15 minutes, headquarters transmitted a follow-up request, noting the delay and emphasizing the urgency of the report. Hargreaves responded with a partial transmission. He provided general status information but omitted specific grid coordinates. He cited signal interference and equipment instability as reasons for incomplete data. The transmission lasted under 2 minutes. He terminated it immediately after completion. Within 30 minutes, Japanese artillery targeted a relay station approximately 700 meters to the west. The shells destroyed a radio set and injured 2 operators. The station had transmitted a full report shortly before the shelling. Hargreaves's position remained unaffected. This incident was reported through normal casualty channels. The destroyed radio set was logged as combat loss. The injured operators were evacuated. The correlation between transmission timing and shelling was not formally investigated. However, the event triggered internal concern at regimental headquarters. The loss of communication equipment in a critical sector further degraded coordination. Staff officers requested explanations for the delayed and incomplete reports from Hargreaves's station. The battalion signal officer summoned Hargreaves for a procedural review. The review was not disciplinary in nature. It focused on communication performance, reporting delays, and deviation from standardized formats. The officer referenced the recent directive and asked Hargreaves to explain his transmission behavior. Hargreaves cited persistent interference, overlapping signals, and equipment limitations. He did not explicitly state that he was withholding information due to interception concerns. He framed his actions as technical adjustments rather than operational decisions. The officer acknowledged the technical issues but reiterated the importance of compliance with reporting standards. He emphasized that incomplete data created coordination risks and potentially endangered other units. There was no formal reprimand. No written warning was issued. However, Hargreaves was instructed to prioritize completeness over signal conditions unless transmission was physically impossible. The message was clear. Operational doctrine remained unchanged. For Hargreaves, the review confirmed that his informal adaptations were not institutionally recognized. The system continued to evaluate his performance based on communication output rather than tactical security. The stakes had now shifted. His earlier adjustments had been invisible. They were embedded within technical language and routine procedures. Now, they were in direct conflict with explicit command expectations. He faced 2 incompatible obligations: to transmit complete information as required by doctrine and to reduce exposure risk based on frontline experience. There was no formal mechanism for resolving this contradiction. Over the following days, similar tensions emerged across multiple signal units. Field logs indicate increased instances of delayed transmissions, abbreviated reports, and selective omission of sensitive data, despite the new directive. At the same time, regimental headquarters issued multiple follow-up memoranda expressing concern about reporting inconsistencies. The memoranda cited coordination failures, delayed artillery support, and inaccurate supply routing. The system began to push back. Signal officers were instructed to monitor operator performance more closely. Equipment inspections increased in frequency. Transmission logs were reviewed for compliance with reporting standards. These measures focused on enforcing doctrine, not on reassessing its assumptions. Hargreaves adjusted his behavior cautiously. He increased transmission completeness during daylight hours, when Japanese artillery activity was lower. At night, he continued to compress reports and omit precise coordinates when signal conditions indicated active monitoring. This compromise was informal and personal. It was not coordinated with other operators. It was an attempt to balance conflicting obligations without institutional support. The operational consequences remained ambiguous. On several nights, reduced transmission coincided with decreased shelling in his sector. On other nights, shelling occurred regardless of his behavior. There was no consistent pattern that could establish clear causality. At the same time, coordination problems persisted. Several patrols reported receiving outdated movement instructions. Supply deliveries were delayed due to incomplete location data. Artillery support was occasionally misdirected. From the command perspective, communication failures now posed risks comparable to enemy action. The tension between tactical security and operational coordination reached its peak. Hargreaves's role had evolved into an unofficial filter within the communication system. He was no longer simply transmitting information. He was actively shaping what information entered the command network based on his assessment of risk. This role was not acknowledged. It was not authorized. It was not visible in formal structures. Yet it had real operational consequences. Every omission potentially reduced enemy targeting accuracy. Every omission also reduced command awareness. The benefits and risks were distributed unevenly across the system, with no centralized oversight. By mid-October, the communication network on Guadalcanal functioned as a hybrid system. Official doctrine remained in place, but frontline operators increasingly modified their behavior in practice. The result was a fragmented structure shaped by individual judgment rather than institutional design. Hargreaves remained under routine supervision. He continued to receive directives emphasizing reporting completeness. He continued to receive field evidence suggesting that full transmission increased exposure. The system offered no resolution. The pause he had initiated weeks earlier had now placed him in direct conflict with operational authority. What began as a technical hesitation had become a sustained deviation from institutional expectations. The risk was no longer abstract. It was embedded in daily procedure, monitored by command, and enforced through performance review. Hargreaves continued operating within this unresolved tension, balancing competing demands without formal guidance, institutional support, or operational clarity. By late October 1942, the communication environment on Guadalcanal had stabilized in form but not in principle. The frontline situation remained volatile, yet the structural features of the signal network had settled into a persistent pattern. Official doctrine continued to demand full, standardized reporting, while practical operation increasingly relied on selective transmission, compression, and delay. This dual system was never formally acknowledged. It emerged as a functional compromise rather than an institutional reform. Regimental headquarters continued to issue directives emphasizing coordination, reporting accuracy, and transmission discipline. Signal officers continued to inspect equipment and review logs for procedural compliance. Training materials distributed during this period reflected pre-war communication doctrine, emphasizing reliability, redundancy, and continuous connectivity. At the same time, field-level behavior continued to diverge. Signal logs from October and early November show consistent evidence of abbreviated reports, irregular transmission schedules, and selective omission of detailed positional data. These patterns appear across multiple units, independent of each other. There is no indication of centralized coordination or formal policy change. The adaptation remained informal, decentralized, and largely invisible to higher command. Japanese artillery activity also evolved. Shelling became less concentrated on known relay stations and more dispersed across suspected operational areas. This shift likely reflected multiple factors: changes in Japanese reconnaissance capabilities, altered tactical priorities, and the cumulative effect of reduced signal exposure. No single cause can be isolated. What can be established is that the earlier pattern of shelling immediately following extended transmissions became less consistent by November. For operators like Hargreaves, this change did not produce a clear resolution. The threat perception remained. The technical conditions remained. The operational contradictions remained. His daily routine continued unchanged in structure. He monitored signal conditions, adjusted antenna positioning, maintained equipment, logged interference patterns, and responded to transmission requests. What had changed was not the procedure itself, but the interpretive framework through which he executed it. Transmission was no longer treated as a neutral technical act. It had become a tactical decision. Hargreaves continued to compress reports whenever possible. He avoided transmitting precise grid coordinates during periods of high interference. He delayed non-essential messages until daylight. He terminated transmissions early if overlapping signals appeared. These behaviors were never formally sanctioned. They were tolerated through omission rather than approval. In November, the operational focus on Guadalcanal began to shift. Japanese ground activity declined further, and U.S. forces transitioned from defensive posture to limited offensive operations. Communication demands remained high, but the character of coordination changed. Movement became more deliberate. Artillery support became more centralized. Supply routes stabilized. As a result, some of the immediate pressures on the signal network eased. Longer-range communication infrastructure was improved. Additional equipment arrived. Relay stations were repositioned with greater attention to concealment. These adjustments reduced some of the technical vulnerabilities that had defined earlier phases of the campaign. However, the underlying contradiction remained unresolved. There was still no formal doctrine addressing signal emission exposure as a tactical liability. There was no institutional framework for balancing communication necessity against detection risk. The system had adapted behaviorally, not structurally. Hargreaves remained in his role until early December, when he was rotated out of forward operations due to equipment reassignment and unit reorganization. His replacement inherited the same technical procedures, the same doctrine, and the same operational environment. There is no record of Hargreaves submitting any formal report describing his transmission decisions as tactical adaptations. His field logs contain only technical observations, interference patterns, signal overlap, equipment performance. From an institutional perspective, his actions did not exist. After the Guadalcanal campaign concluded, U.S. military communication doctrine underwent gradual revision. Later field manuals incorporated greater emphasis on emission control, transmission minimization, and signal concealment. These changes were not attributed to specific individuals or incidents. They emerged through aggregated operational analysis across multiple theaters. In post-war assessments, signal interception and direction finding were recognized as significant tactical factors. Training materials from the late 1940s and early 1950s reflect a growing awareness that communication systems themselves could generate operational vulnerability. However, during the Guadalcanal campaign, this understanding remained fragmented and informal. The adaptations made by frontline operators were not documented as innovations. They were not recognized as doctrinal contributions. They were absorbed silently into later institutional practice without attribution. Hargreaves did not receive any commendation, citation, or official acknowledgement related to his transmission behavior. His service record lists standard operational duties and routine equipment maintenance. There is no reference to signal security or tactical discretion. From a command perspective, his performance was evaluated through conventional metrics: equipment functionality, message delivery, procedural compliance. The informal role he had assumed, filtering information based on tactical risk, was not part of the evaluative framework. Yet this role had real operational consequences. His decisions affected the flow of information within the command network. They shaped what commanders knew, when they knew it, and with what level of detail. They altered the balance between situational awareness and exposure. These effects cannot be quantified precisely. They cannot be isolated from other variables. They remain embedded within a complex operational environment where causality is distributed and indirect. What can be established is that the communication system on Guadalcanal functioned through a layer of informal human judgment that was never formally acknowledged. Signal operators were not simply technical intermediaries. They were active participants in operational risk management. This role emerged not through training or doctrine, but through sustained exposure to consequence. The pause that Hargreaves initiated in September did not reshape the system in any visible or immediate way. It did not produce a formal policy change. It did not generate institutional recognition. What it did was reveal a structural reality, that in certain operational conditions, silence could be as consequential as transmission. Not silence as absence, but silence as selective restraint. This form of discretion existed beneath the level of official documentation. It was practiced individually, learned informally, and transmitted through experience rather than instruction.